When people think about World War II, they usually picture tanks and fighter planes. But behind all that was another threat that terrified governments and soldiers alike: chemical weapons. There was an organized use of poison on a massive scale, and at several moments during the war, the world came dangerously close to something even worse. The first large-scale use of chemical weapons was during World War I in April 1915, near Ypres in Belgium, when German forces released around 150 tons of chlorine gas from thousands of cylinders. A green cloud drifted over French and Algerian troops. Men who had never seen anything like it started choking, clawing at their throats, and collapsing where they stood. That was just the beginning. Soon both sides were using chlorine, then phosgene, which was even deadlier, and later mustard gas, which burned skin and lungs. By the end of the war, chemical weapons had killed about 90,000 soldiers and injured more than 1 million. Many survivors never recovered. Some had lungs so damaged they could barely climb stairs for the rest of their lives. Others were blinded. Some carried painful scars on their skin until the day they died. Entire hospitals were filled with gas victims who could not breathe without coughing up blood. The shock of that experience stayed with the world long after the fighting stopped in November 1918. People believed that gas warfare crossed a line that should never be crossed again. That fear led to the signing of the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Major powers like Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union agreed not to use chemical and biological weapons in future wars. On paper, it looked like progress, but the agreement had a huge loophole. It banned the use of these weapons, not their production or storage. Countries were still allowed to research them, manufacture them, and pile them up in warehouses. Many governments also added reservations, saying they could respond with chemical weapons if they were attacked first. Throughout the 1930s, chemical research never really stopped. In fact, it expanded. Britain improved its mustard gas stockpiles and built production facilities. France maintained large reserves left over from World War I. The Soviet Union invested heavily in chemical defense and offense, running secret programs in remote areas. Japan developed its own chemical weapons industry as it prepared for expansion in Asia. Military leaders believed that if another global war started, gas would return to the battlefield just like it had before. So they trained soldiers to react fast. Gas mask drills became routine. Civilians were also pulled into this world of fear. In cities like London, Berlin, and Moscow, governments distributed millions of gas masks to ordinary families. In Britain alone, around 38 million masks were issued by 1939. Schools trained children on how to use them. Public buildings prepared air raid shelters in case gas bombs fell from the sky. Industries produced antidotes and protective suits. Germany's position in all this was shaped by bitter memory and ambition. After World War I, Germany had been restricted by the Treaty of Versailles, which limited its military power. But when Adolf Hitler came into power in 1933, he began rebuilding Germany's armed forces in secret, and then openly. Hitler personally remembered the gas attacks of 1918. In October of that year near Ypres, he was temporarily blinded by mustard gas and hospitalized. That experience did not turn him into an opponent of chemical warfare. Instead, it made him aware of its power. Under Nazi rule, Germany rebuilt its chemical weapons program aggressively. Factories expanded. Research intensified. By the mid-1930s, Germany had stockpiled large amounts of mustard gas and other agents, preparing for a war they believed was coming. Then in 1936, something happened that changed the scale of danger. A German chemist named Gerhard Schrader was working for the giant chemical company IG Farben. He was trying to create stronger insecticides to protect crops. Germany wanted to increase food production and reduce dependence on imports. Schrader had already been experimenting with organophosphate compounds, chemicals designed to kill insects by attacking their nervous systems. During one experiment in December 1936, he created a new substance. It was later named Tabun. At first, It seemed like just another lab result. Then things went wrong. Schrader and his assistant were exposed to a tiny amount of vapor. Within minutes, they felt dizziness, blurred vision, chest tightness, and muscle weakness. They could barely walk out of the lab. It took them weeks to fully recover. That was the moment they realized this was not just an insect killer. It was something far more dangerous. What Tabun actually did was that it attacked the nervous system by blocking an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. This enzyme normally breaks down a chemical messenger in the body called acetylcholine. When the enzyme is blocked, acetylcholine builds up and keeps sending signals to muscles without stopping. The result is chaos inside the body. Muscles twitch uncontrollably. The victim sweats heavily, drools, vomits, and loses control of basic functions. The chest tightens because the breathing muscles cannot relax. Eventually, the lungs stop working. The person suffocates while still aware of what's happening. When the German Army Weapons Office learned about Tabun, they reacted immediately. The project was classified under strict secrecy. Schrader was ordered to continue research, but now under military control. By 1937, plans were in place to produce Tabun on a large scale. A major production facility was built in Dichernfurt, a town in Silesia, which is in present-day Poland. The plant was operated by a company linked to IG Farben and began large-scale output by 1942. Workers there handled extremely dangerous materials, often with poor protection. Accidental exposures were common. Some workers suffered long-term health problems. Despite these risks, production continued. By 1945, Germany had produced about 12,000 tons of Tabun, filling thousands of artillery shells and aerial bombs. In 1938, Schrader and his team made another discovery. While modifying chemical formulas, they created an even more powerful nerve agent. It was later named sarin, because of the initials of the scientists involved in its development. Sarin was more volatile than Tabun, meaning it could evaporate quickly and spread through the air. It was also more toxic. Just a few drops on the skin could kill within minutes. Inhalation could bring death even faster. German scientists tested it on animals and were shocked by how quickly it worked. Later in 1944, a third nerve agent called Soman was developed. Soman was even more persistent and could bind to the enzyme in a way that made medical treatment much harder. What surprises many people is that these nerve agents were never used in battle during World War II. Despite having thousands of tons ready, Germany never fired a Tabun or sarin shell at British, American, or Soviet forces. The reason was fear and uncertainty. German intelligence believed the Allies had similar nerve agents. They assumed Britain and the United States must have made the same scientific breakthroughs. In reality, the Allies had not discovered nerve agents yet. They were still relying mainly on older chemicals like mustard gas. But Hitler and his generals expected that if Germany used nerve gas first, the response would be massive and devastating. There was also the memory of World War I. Chemical warfare in 1915 and 1917 had led to retaliation from both sides. Leaders in Berlin knew that once gas warfare started, it would spread quickly. Germany was already under heavy bombing by 1943 and 1944. The risk of adding chemical retaliation on top of that was something the leadership did not want to trigger. But while Germany held back its most advanced poisons, another theater of war was already seeing chemical attacks in action. Because in Asia, the rules were different. In July 1937, fighting broke out near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing. What started as a clash between Japanese and Chinese troops quickly turned into a full-scale war. Within months, major cities like Shanghai and Nanjing were engulfed in violence. This conflict became known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, and it lasted until 1945. From the very beginning, the fighting was brutal. Civilian areas were bombed. Prisoners were executed. Chemical weapons became part of the strategy. Under the rule of Hirohito and Japan's military leadership, chemical agents were approved for battlefield use in China. Orders allowing gas attacks were passed down through high command. One of the key military leaders involved in campaigns in China was General Shunroku Hata, who served as commander of Japanese forces in central China at different times during the war. Japanese units used mustard gas and lewisite repeatedly. Lewisite, which contained arsenic, caused immediate pain and severe tissue injury. Soldiers exposed to it often screamed from the burning sensation before collapsing. Between 1937 and 1945, historians estimate that Japan carried out more than 2,000 chemical attacks across China. Some researchers believe that over 60,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians were killed or seriously injured by chemical weapons during these years. In many cases, Chinese troops had almost no protection. Gas masks were scarce. Protective suits were nearly non-existent. Japanese forces often fired artillery shells filled with gas directly into trenches and defensive positions. When the shells burst, the chemicals spread through low ground where soldiers were hiding. During the Battle of Wuhan in 1938, one of the largest battles of the war, chemical attacks played a role in breaking Chinese defensive lines. Wuhan was strategically important because it sat along the Yangtze River and served as a transportation hub. Japanese forces used gas shells to weaken resistance in certain areas, forcing Chinese troops to retreat. The use of chemical weapons gave Japan a tactical advantage in situations where conventional assaults were costly. But the battlefield was only part of the story. Behind the lines, something even darker was happening. Near the city of Harbin in occupied Manchuria, the Japanese military established a secret research center known as Unit 731. Officially, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In reality, it was a center for biological and chemical warfare experiments. It was led by General Shiro Ishii, a medical doctor and officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. From 1936 to 1945, Unit 731 conducted experiments on thousands of prisoners, most of them Chinese civilians and captured soldiers. Some were Russians and other nationalities. Prisoners were deliberately exposed to mustard gas, phosgene, and other toxic agents to study how the human body reacted. Some were placed in sealed chambers and gassed. Others had chemicals applied directly to their skin. Many died in terrible pain. Autopsies were often carried out while victims were still alive to study organ damage. The exact number of people who died in Unit 731 is debated, but estimates range from 3,000 to over 10,000 inside the facility itself. Beyond that, biological and chemical weapons developed there were later used in the field, contributing to even more deaths. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, many expected the leaders of Unit 731 to face war crimes trials. Instead, the situation took a different turn. The United States secretly offered immunity to Shiro Ishii and several other members of Unit 731. In exchange, the U.S. obtained their research data on biological and chemical warfare. American officials believed this information could be valuable during the growing tensions with the Soviet Union. As a result, many of the people responsible for these experiments avoided prosecution. For countless victims and their families, justice never came. While Japan was using chemical weapons openly in China, Europe was heading toward a different kind of chemical horror, and the targets were not enemy soldiers in battle. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. As German forces pushed east, special SS units, known as Einsatzgruppen, followed behind. Their task was to eliminate Jews, Roma, communist officials, and anyone considered an enemy of the Nazi regime. They carried out mass shootings in forests, fields, and ravines. One of the most infamous massacres took place at Babi Yar, near Kiev in September 1941, where over 33,000 Jews were shot in just 2 days. But mass shootings had limits. They required large amounts of ammunition and personnel. They were also slow. Even some of the shooters began to suffer psychological strain. Nazi leaders wanted a method that was faster, more controlled, and less personal for the killers. By late 1941, experiments began with gas vans. These were trucks with sealed compartments in the back. Victims were loaded inside, and engine exhaust was piped into the compartment. The carbon monoxide in the exhaust gradually replaced the oxygen. People inside suffocated during the drive to burial sites. These vans were used in places like Chelmno, which began operations in December 1941. Soon, the system became even more organized. Permanent extermination camps were built in occupied Poland. Camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor were designed specifically for mass killing. Rail lines delivered prisoners directly to these sites. Upon arrival, victims were often separated by age and health. Those deemed unfit for forced labor were sent immediately to gas chambers. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the killing agent used was Zyklon B, originally developed as a pesticide. Zyklon B contained hydrogen cyanide absorbed into small pellets. When the pellets were exposed to air, they released a deadly gas. Prisoners were told they were going to take showers for disinfection. Once they were inside the sealed chamber, the doors were locked. The SS guards wearing gas masks dropped Zyklon B pellets through openings in the roof. Within minutes, panic filled the room as the gas spread. Victims struggled to breathe. Cyanide blocks the body's ability to use oxygen at the cellular level. Even though oxygen is present in the air, the body cannot process it. Death usually came within 15 to 20 minutes. Between 1942 and 1944, around 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz alone. Most were Jews from across Europe. Others included Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, and Roma. The killing was systematic and organized. Crematoria were built to dispose of the bodies. Records were kept. Trains ran on schedule. Treblinka operated from July 1942 to October 1943 and used carbon monoxide gas from engine exhaust. Approximately 870,000 people were killed there in little more than a year. Sobibor and Belzec functioned in similar ways. Even as this industrial killing continued, governments outside Germany feared that the nerve agents might soon be used on battlefields across Europe. That fear would soon collide with reality in an unexpected place. In southern Italy, in the busy harbor of a city called Bari. By late 1943, the war in Italy was in full force. Allied forces had landed in Sicily in July and then moved on to the Italian mainland in September. The port city of Bari on the Adriatic coast became a key supply hub. Ships packed the harbor, unloading fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment for troops, fighting their way north against German forces. On the evening of December 2, 1943, the harbor was crowded with more than 30 Allied ships. Lights from the port made it easier to work at night, but they also made Bari an easy target. That night, around 100 German bombers from the Luftwaffe flew in low over the Adriatic Sea and attacked without much warning. The air raid lasted less than an hour, but the damage was devastating. 17 ships were sunk. Several others were heavily damaged. Fuel spilled into the water and caught fire, turning the harbor into an inferno. Among the ships hit was the American Liberty ship SS John Harvey. The SS John Harvey carried a secret cargo. Hidden in its hold were 2,000 M47A1 bombs filled with mustard gas. Each bomb contained about 60 to 70 pounds of sulfur mustard. The United States had shipped these weapons to Europe as a precaution. The official policy was that they would only be used if Germany used chemical weapons first. Very few people in Bari knew the bombs were there. Even local commanders were not fully informed. When German bombs struck the John Harvey, the ship exploded violently. The blast scattered debris across the harbor. The mustard gas bombs were ruptured in the explosion. As the fire spread, mustard gas mixed with fuel oil and seawater. The toxic chemical drifted through the air and settled on the water's surface. Sailors who jumped into the harbor to escape the flames swam through a mixture of burning oil and mustard gas without realizing it. At first, no one understood what was happening. Survivors were covered in what looked like thick, dirty oil. Medical teams focused on treating burns and blast injuries. But within hours, strange symptoms appeared. Men began complaining of severe eye pain. Their eyelids swelled until they couldn't see. Skin that had seemed fine earlier developed large, painful blisters. Some victims began coughing violently. Others struggled to breathe. Doctors at Bari initially didn't know they were dealing with chemical exposure. It was only when a U.S. Army medical officer Lieutenant Colonel Stuart F. Alexander investigated the cases that mustard gas poisoning was confirmed. The incident was quickly covered up. Allied leaders feared public panic and did not want Germany to know that chemical weapons had been brought into the theater. Reports were classified. Survivors were ordered not to discuss what they had experienced. For years, many victims didn't even know why they had suffered such severe injuries. The truth slowly came out after the war. By 1944, when Germany was losing ground on every major front, gas chambers continued operating in Auschwitz until November that year. In January 1945, as Soviet forces approached, SS guards tried to erase evidence of what had happened. Crematoria were blown up, documents were destroyed, prisoners who could still walk were marched westward. When Soviet troops entered Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they found about 7,000 survivors left behind. Many were too weak to move. They were skeletal, sick, and starving. Inside storage warehouses, Soviet soldiers found piles of human hair, thousands of shoes, eyeglasses, and suitcases. These were the belongings of people who had been gassed and killed. When Allied forces captured German chemical facilities in 1945, they discovered stockpiles and research documents describing Tabun, Sarin, and Soman. The Western Allies were stunned. They had not known that Germany had developed an entirely new class of nerve agents. On May 7, 1945, Germany finally surrendered unconditionally. Still, the end of the war did not mean the end of chemical warfare. The knowledge had spread. The stockpiles were seized. Scientists were captured and questioned. The Soviet Union began its own nerve agent programs, building on German research. The United States also expanded its chemical weapons development in places like Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Japan's abandoned chemical weapons in China continued harming civilians for decades. Unexploded shells still injure people even in the 21st century.